head came off. Man, these things are awesome. Really, if you think about it, that shotgun is like... How tall are the kids? This shotgun shoots bullets that are like as big as a car. It's probably about the size of a, I don't know, sedan or something like that. It's huge. Welcome to Folding Ideas, Season 3, Episode 2.1. Last time on Folding Ideas we talked about the end of Evangelion and particularly focusing a lot on Shinji and Shinji's role within the narrative and also the whole meta story surrounding it about whether or not what's his name? Whether or not Anno was trolling his fan base by making it that way. And a lot of people sort of mentioned like, hey, you missed this, you missed that. And the one note that I do want to make actually on that front is afterwards I was talking with some people, and particularly I was watching, like once I was done I started watching a lot of the other reviews that people have done. I will say that I started to get, I don't know if you'd call it Stockholm Syndrome, but at this point I actually think like, barring certain parts of it and certain themes which I think are really clunky, like a lot of End of Ada is actually just like this absolutely brilliant sort of postmodern movie about the end of the world. One of the things that I noticed in watching these other things was a cultural or an interpretive difference that you could come up with depending on which version of the show you had seen, that there were these differences in the dubs and the interpretation that I got out of the movie depending on which dub I was watching. So I watched it and I made all of my notes and I edited from the original Japanese voiceover work. The English voice dub in particular is a lot more sympathetic towards Shinji. Much more pathetic. He really sounds like a child lost in the supermarket because of the way that the dialogue is presented. Asuka comes across as much more abusive. She's still a pretty hard-edged character either way. Why shouldn't he behave such and such a way given how much of a bitch Asuka is to him? It's a little bit more understandable when in the English dub she does come across as a lot more aggressive and abusive in a way that seems unjustified. Whereas in the Japanese dub, his voice work, particularly during his breakdown, the instrumentality switchover, in the Japanese it's not just angry or scared. It's spiteful. He is yelling these things with the intent of causing hurt. And you hear that in the Japanese, but you don't necessarily get that in the English. So that was one of the things that I noticed right away that could certainly have an impact on the way that people interpret this. A lot of the other things that came out, and people made some very good points, and I was honestly overwhelmed with the feedback, and I wasn't able to respond to everyone, but I did read more or less everything that I saw, and I really enjoyed the conversations that people started having about this. I was expecting, honestly, a little bit more backlash, but a lot of people really seemed to resonate with this idea, and in particular the idea of Shinji sort of as a nice guy. I don't get why women don't want to hang out with me. I'm a nice guy. I saw that when I was watching through, but I couldn't script it in a satisfactory way, so I just kind of put in as much of his dialogue as possible. and hope that other people would pick up on it, and a number of people did. Now, there is one more thing that I want to dedicate some time to, and I didn't really manage to cover all of the possibilities, and so I'm going to cover something that we'll just call Consideration 4. Consideration 4 is that the two endings of Evangelion, the broadcast ending and the movie, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Now, there are a number of fan theories that have cropped up surrounding this and that go in sort of a similar vein here, but by and large I disregard most of them, since a lot of them are very, I find them apologetic in an unsatisfactory way, because most of them seem to be focused in particular on trying to bring End of Evangelion and the finale of the show into the same timeline. A lot of them revolve around a notion that one happens and then the other, or one happens at a specific point within the other. Now, before we go any further with this, I want to be explicitly clear here that this is largely talking about what happens to Shinji. By and large, and I would say this about the entirety of End of Evangelion, anything that involves the secondary characters, anyone in Nerve headquarters, I would say that 100% that is exactly what they had planned to happen in the ending of the show anyway, like in terms of Seal or Sele. And even the part, like, people melting into Tang, I think that was planned from the get-go. That was what they wanted to have happen. So in consideration for that, the two endings are essentially divergent. They are the two possible outcomes of a single divergent, like, reality-altering event. And I believe that towards the end of the show, they started playing with this idea of duality. And you do see a lot of this sense of duality. Like, I can see a lot of this duality coming out, particularly with people from a Buddhist Shinto background interpreting Christian mythology. They're going to see, that good versus evil nature, and sort of like the duality of man is kind of a big thing in Christianity. That it's like, oh well, within all, that man is at war with his evil side. Man is fallen, and that the state that man needs to attempt to reclaim is one of perfection and one of unity. So while it is not perfectly mapped to that, the real life belief system, I think those themes resonated with them in some way, and they started trying to insert them towards the end. And so I would propose that the two endings both happen, but they both happen as parallel possibilities of a single event. And what I'm going to use to back this up is actually a reference to the newer, the rebuild of Evangelion, which, note, I haven't watched yet. So this is a bit of an experiment. I'm going to put this idea out there, and then I'm going to confirm this idea, and I'll report back later to see if it actually pans out. But one of the things that's tipping me off towards this is that in the naming of all of the episodes or the movies within Rebuild of Evangelion, there is that duality, that contemporaneous duality in the names of all of them. So it's like, you will not pass. They all have a parenthetic disqualifier inserted into the middle of their statement, so that the statement, as it exists on the paper, is at the same time both the affirmative version of that statement and the opposite of affirmative. Negative. The non-negative. The negative version. Doesn't happen. The titles for all of them, are rooted into that kind of a duality as a theme. And now I want to see, I haven't watched them yet, but I'm going to, and I want to confirm whether or not that theme carries through into the actual movies themselves in some way or another. I would expect it, if it is there, to be quite subtle. But I'm thinking that the entire purpose of Rebuild is ultimately to expand this idea of duality so that it runs throughout the entire show. That the original show and the new show will essentially sit in parallel to each other as a dual exploration of the same series of events coming to either similar or disparate conclusions. What will ultimately confirm this will unfortunately have to wait until, like, 2015 or so, when the final movie in the series actually comes out in Japan, because that's the one that will cover the same it'll cover the same events as End of Evangelion and the end of the TV show. So we've got a few years left before we can ultimately confirm whether or not that's what they're doing. But I suspect that's what I suspect that's the way that they're going to go with it, because I see a lot of those themes just sort of being inserted in very subtle ways. So what that would not be, it's not, in my mind, it's not that, the reason why I find a lot of the fan theories really sort of unsatisfying is that none of them is clean in any way, shape, or form. In terms, like, particularly when they want to go with this whole thing about, it's like, oh, well, this one happens and this one happens during this other event. Because by and large, how they end up being is that, like, the end of the show either happens in Shinji's mind, kind of during the whole, like, clustery montage of things, and then he wakes up on the beach, or it happens in Shinji's mind after the events on the beach. Why I find this unsatisfying is that they are still these giant polar opposite events, and I just don't find it in any way remotely satisfying to think that, okay, well, Shinji has this massive meltdown, that he has that meltdown, and then goes through a phase of self-acceptance and realizing that he has control over his own existence, and then immediately just slips into this slummy funk. And the other version isn't much better either, because the other version would be that it's post-instrumentality. So he chokes Asuka on the beach and then sits there, and at some indeterminate period in the future, he just gets over it. The reason I find that unsatisfactory is because there is absolutely nothing that happens in those final moments that leave any sort of indicator that circumstances are going to change, that events are in motion. In fact, the ending of the movie is explicitly static. It is extremely static. It is not an ending where things are in motion and things are restarting. There's a film theory that basically says that characters are doing whatever you last saw them doing until otherwise confirmed. I don't find it satisfying to think that it's like, oh, he then just got over it, because to me they both start at the same midpoint. At the beginning of those final episodes, it could go either way. I find it a lot more satisfying to believe that they're exploring possibility and exploring duality than I find it to try and reconcile them both into a singular timeline or singular event sequence. End of Evangelion is starting to give me a headache. Alright, I think I'm done. I'm done with End of Evangelion for now. Oh man, I didn't even get into like Asuka and the whole thing. Like, I was sitting on the bus, like there's this one moment, like Asuka's pathos just gets heartbreakingly sad, both because it's so depressing, but it's also so sincere. In particular when she's fighting all of the mass production angels, and she's got this line, that you can't hurt me because I've got mama with me. And it's just, so it's heartbreaking. It's just, wow. Yeah. So thank you. Like with this end of Evangelion episode, thank you so much for all of the like great conversation, the great points that have been brought up. I think whether or not you even like End of Eva, it gives you something really interesting to talk about. And this is kind of why I tried to focus on the meta level of it anyway, is because that's almost like more entertaining than the actual thing. Not so tiny little tidbit. A lot of people say Sele. They refer to it as Sele, and I think that's kind of how it's pronounced in the show. But keep in mind that the people in the show, the voice actors, the original voice actors, don't speak English. I'm pretty sure it's Seal, and the only reason why I say that is because of the apocalyptic references. The show is drawing on all of this Judeo-Christian, particularly Christian mythology, Book of Revelations and all that. And so by them being Seal and the members of Seal, the Seals has a lot more metaphoric resonance to it. Like it makes more sense than just Sele, which is kind of this utterly nonsense word. So I believe that it's just a Japanese transliteration of the word seal.